performers, say like my friend Mary Travers, or Joan Baez, or who's that woman around, Judy Collins, and so on and so forth, to use some pretty well-known examples. They take a traditional, say, Appalachian song and basically turn it into a pop song. That is, they musically function not at the level of high art or operatic leader performance, but at musical comedy. I mean, they do what Mary Martin did so well, or what Jenny Lind did so well. That is, this is not to take away from Joan Baez's. She's a gorgeous, gorgeous singer in total command. I happen to like her because I like her politics, but I think it's important to say that musically she does to an Appalachian song precisely what Marian Anderson did to a spiritual, except that she plugs in at a different level. It's like an old-fashioned telephone exchange, and the operator can plug into tribal, folk, pop, or concert. And that now the operator does it in terms of responding to a call. You say, I want to talk to Madame Callis. Well, she plugs in concert. I want to talk to Connie Boswell of the 1930s. I don't know, Boswell sisters. They did the Andrews sisters. Then you plug in pop. So Joan Baez, again. Joan Baez has been a very honest woman, politically and I think musically. She no longer calls herself a folk singer. She's very conscious of what she did, and she's wanted to expand her repertoire. But I'll tell you why I like her politics. A few years ago, at the time of Tiananmen Square, the Chinese students had a big demonstration in front of the City Hall, and Joan Baez came up from Santa Cruz or Stanford, and she sang a song in Chinese that they had written and in English, and I have radical friends here, I hate to say it, but who were still identifying with Deng Xiaoping. This is these were you've heard this,
yes.
Counter-revolutionaries funded by the CIA, destroying socialism, and on and on and on. Well, when I saw those, I had been in China after the war. I knew many young, when I saw those Chinese students on TV, it brought me back to when I was in my early 20s in Shanghai and marching with young Chinese radicals. And no one was going to tell me that those kids who risked their lives these kids are unarmed. Deng Xiaoping sends in troops in tanks. Where is the choice? So to Joan Baez's credit, to me, her politics are magnificent. She really, to her, freedom is indivisible. You march for freedom throughout the world. Not now, but several years ago, Pete Seeger, this is a tragedy in his life. Though he has sung for freedom all of his life, he could never bring himself to sing for subjected people in the Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe. That is, he felt so much the need to defend the Soviet Union that as far as I'm concerned, it distorted his life. Let me just give you one example in this area. It's in a minute. In Butte, Montana, this is out of labor law, there are many Slavic miners, Serbians, Croatians, Yugoslavs. After World War II, Tito was a hero for almost all the Yugoslavs because he was uniting Yugoslavia and setting a course, a third world, between capitalism and socialism. He broke with Stalin. Stalin tried desperately to set up a counter movement in Yugoslavia, but Tito outfoxed the hardliners. So Stalin excommunicated Tito. At that time, communists were very strong in a union called the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers. That was a big union in Butte. So and wherever communists were strong in unions, they would introduce resolutions to support, their line. And they introduced a resolution of the Butte Miners Local blasting Tito as a counter-revolutionist. That is, that was the Stalin line. Well, the Slavic miners in that union, who had been loyal unionists all of their lives, they just revolted. They threw the leadership out, and then eventually they left the CIO. I bring that up as an example where loyalty to a party line can make one's, this is from the perspective of the leaders, who they were leading that union. They sacrificed their leadership in a good union out of loyalty to some abstract principle that came from Moscow. They were crazy. They should have just ducked the issue, just been opportunistic. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
Now, see, Pete Seeger, when you examine his career very, very carefully, he's been, one reason he's very rigid as a person. He's very puritanical. It's hard to interview him. He's great on a platform. He just opens up, but if you ever met him personally, you just talk to him.
We wrote to him, and
it's hard.
We wrote him, telling him what we were doing, asked for an interview. He sent us back a very nice note in which he managed to never acknowledge we had asked to see him.
Right. It's hard for him.
And everybody says exactly the same thing that you
But
said.
so I'm not making this up.
No.
But see, the dilemma in his life is he has had to live. It's like schizophrenia. He's had to live with a commitment to freedom, but has had to rationalize unfreedom in some parts of the world. Joan Baez, and the contrast is here. Joan Baez has had she just instinctively knows when people are exploited, and she's there. She sang in Czechoslovakia. She's just great. Now,
she was criticized at the end of the Vietnam War because she criticized Hanoi.
Yeah,
and
right.
Got a lot of criticism
with
from
Ho Chi Minh.
Left,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So you are you out of the '60s politically?
Yeah, we're a little younger, but yes, I'm.
But-
I'm 38 years old to give you a perspective.
It's
We're
hard
a little
for me to
younger.
tell.
And,
Are both of you San Franciscans?
Yeah. Oh, no,
No,
natives? We're New Yorkers.
New Yorkers. We both.
And when did you come here?
I've been here almost 10
I
years.
came here in 1976. 16, 17
But were you around Greenwich Village at
I
the
was
time
in
of the? Were you a
I
Did you
was
ever
too
go
young.
to any concerts there?
Oh yeah, a lot, but it was later, in
Later,
the 70s,
yeah.
because in 1961 I was 7 years old.
Right.
So-
Well, all right. So that notion of revival, at least someplace in your scripting or whatever, you have to at least show that you're aware of the difficulties in the term folk song revival, and you don't have to worry about having invented the difficulty, because Charles Seeger commented on it in 1947, if not earlier. Now, here's to me a very important element: what can make the movie great, or any book on it. One would be to show the rainbow of forces in the folk song revival. That is, if it's just an encomium to the Weavers, or to there was a movie about very focused on one song, on the We Shall Overcome. Yeah, and those are interesting, but that's like going to the bay, and sitting there for 24 hours, and then you take a dipper, a soup dipper, and you dip out one scoop of water in 24 hours, and it has some oil in it, or some chemicals or whatever. You analyze it, and then write a big treatise on the waters of the San Francisco Bay. It's just it's a snapshot to one very powerful song, and it was pretty much scripted by Bernice Reagan Johnson, who's not very objective, because part of her own career, she's now she has a position in the Smithsonian, a sort of a curator of Afro-American affairs. So I didn't think that was too hot a film. But if the film can show some of the interplay of the various elements that made the folk song revival, then it can be an exciting film on American experience. And quickly, I think I stated them once, but just again, and not in any particular order, but at least chronologically, you would start with ballad scholarship, because the early collectors who went before even sound recordings, just writing down the songs, in different parts of the United States. John Lomax in 1910 does cowboy songs. Cecil Sharp comes from Britain to Appalachia in 1914, 15, 16, I think, or 13, 14, 15. And there were earlier collectors, and so the material gets into books, magazines, and then Schirmer and other music publishers about 1910 begin bringing out little, like for the piano, piano renditions of
Little songbooks.
about that big,
Uh-huh.
not something like folios, but they are song books, but they had a special name. But it'd be Appalachian songs or Maine songs or cowboy songs. So people begin playing folk songs in the parlors in pianos. That is, you get basically urban intellectuals, one who can read, who can afford to buy music books and have pianos, and for whom folk song has a certain, here's a really important thing, cachet. I mean, why is folk song, before folk song was seen as progressive, why did folk song seem important to English people or Americans, to scholars? Well, one of the answers is antiquity. That is, folk songs were seen as snapshots of distant cultures, or the last relics of cultures that had died, sort of like American Indians were seen as Stone Age people who survived into modern times, or some people in Borneo or the upper Amazon. So folk songs had a certain cultural value as snapshots to a forgotten past. Folk songs also were associated with earlier lifestyles. Whenever you move into whenever a country is industrialized, some people resist. For some people, the pace of change is too fast. Some people cannot deal with modernity. That is, we all have friends who can't deal with traffic signals.
You and a husband do.
Or airplanes get, like some people can't. I haven't learned to make our VCR work. Just some people are good at it. The moment a vacuum cleaner comes out or a home computer, or they buy it, and others just can't make the damn thing work. So attaching yourself to aspects of the past, whether it's costume or literature or the old-time religion or whatever, there are just certain values. Those become anchors. They help moor. It's like an anchor to a ship. It moors the ship at the dock or in the bay. It helps moor you. It gives you some roots. It gives you some strength. So that's that. There's a snapshot aspect. There's the anchor metaphor, but also folk songs were often seen, were not understood in their full complexity. That is, folk songs were seen as simple in language and simple in music, and the very notion of simplicity became a counter to a complex world. So there were obviously many people at different levels had reasons to respond to. I'm dealing with outsiders here, with urban intellectuals who had reasons to respond to folk song once folk song became available in books, and then ultimately on records, and then in film. For people within the society, within what I call a folk society, the process is less conscious. That is, you do old things because you do old things. That is, it's part of your life pattern. But you don't really become conscious of the value of it until you're threatened to some degree by the outside. That is, within a folk society, you don't have the option of many styles. That is, Aunt Molly Jackson sang the way she sang because that's the way her childhood companions sang and their father and mother sang, and she didn't hear. There was no radio, there were no records. She didn't hear other styles until she went to New York City. So, urbanization, industrialization, big cities, progress, all of these things break down the isolation within of texts and tunes in folk societies. So you have to at least distinguish between the retention in a folk society and acquisition externally. And sometimes those reasons coincide, but sometimes they don't. Now, the commercial music business, most people in the United States date it to the 1820s or 1830s with minstrel shows. And you begin to get white performers of black plantation songs. And they're very hokey. There are some elements that are tie them together, but it's really white people in blackface. They use the term cork up. They take burnt cork, burnt cork artists, Ethiopian serenaders, but they begin to make money, and they have circuits. They make money out of the presentation of a pseudo or a partial version of African American folk music. Then very few folk songs published by sheet music publishers in the middle of the last century, but you begin to get minstrel songs on sheet music and minstrel song books. Just before the Civil War, you begin to get some white abolitionists in the South who begin to appreciate what we would now call authentic Negro spirituals, or songs of worship. And you get early collections of slave songs, and then after the war, in the newly freed Southern black colleges, or newly created Southern black colleges, you've read about this, the Fisk Jubilee Singers. They go all over to raise money, and they begin singing spirit. They go to Queen Victoria, for example, Paris. We know in retrospect that they begin the process of this concertization process begins with the Fisk Jubilee Singers, but they don't get so far from Afro-American style that their music, say in Carnegie Hall, is not seen as different from European concert music. Then about 1900, folklorists in the United States following the Child on the Child ballads begin seeing that because we grew so rapidly, the westward expansion, the railroad, logging, cowboy songs, mining songs. So American collectors begin, say with 1910, cowboy songs. The early books, one of the earliest books to have logging songs is about 1915, and by 1927, George Corson has a collection of coal anthracite ballads, like the Molly Maguire's kinds of Celtic songs in Pennsylvania. Now, so the process of collecting, academic collecting, and commercial publishing of sheet music and songbooks and then records begins to intersect, so that when Schirmer, say, does not a folk song collection for scholars, but a folk song collection for the parlor piano, that's the merging of the world of scholarship and the music industry. And then I wrote an article on sort of the origins of hillbilly music in the Journal of American Folklore, about 1961, an important article, Hillbilly Music Source and Symbol. And I tried to deal with the discovery by the music industry of hillbilly music, Appalachian folk music, and the blues. And then you begin, two terms, race records and hillbilly records. So entrepreneurs learn that there is a market in vernacular societies. You don't have to sell them Caruso. You can sell them Vernon Dalhart or Bessie Smith, or Ma Rainey, and you begin to establish an element in commercial music of making money out of folk or folk-like, folk-like, and that's very strong in the 20s. I mean, Trixie Smith, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and later on, Billie Holiday, and on and on.
Now, was there an effort back then to sell it outside the communities themselves?
Not initially.
I didn't think so. Yeah,
no, not
it was
initially.
Only to sell it, market it, and we can make these records and sell them to this market.
Right. We could sell. In fact, but about 1924, Columbia Records recorded Riley Puckett and Gid Tanner, and in a magazine called Talking Machine World, which was the trade journal of the phonograph record industry. They had huge advertisements and an early ad. I reproduced it in an article. It's called Southern Music Sweeps Northward. That is, they began to realize that through migration, people outside the region, some people would want to buy their native music, but also in the 20s, once the record, here's where technology and cultural values intersect. Just as collecting intersected with song publication, the availability of records you didn't have to be able to read music. And they were, 35 cents, 50 cents, 75 cents. The availability of the records begins to make records in quantity, they begin to make a qualitative change in the audience. So urban intellectuals who liked folk music that they found in scholars' anthologies or played on the piano discover the records. So like Carl Sandburg, for example, he knew John Lomax, and Carl Sandburg had a friend, a journalist in Chicago, Lloyd Lewis, who wrote a biography of Abraham Lincoln. There was a Tam Pierce, who was a Celtic scholar, University of Chicago. They had a little coterie, and they, in one of their memoirs, one of the guys said, we began buying cowboy songs when they first came out. Oh, that's 1919. Now, in Berkeley, there was an important scholar in Berkeley in the early 20s, Robert Winslow Gordon. There's a biography of him. He's important because he went on to start the archive of folk song at the Library of Congress. When Gordon was 22 and 23, a young professor at Berkeley, he was a folk song scholar from Harvard. He went down to the Oakland waterfront on the estuary, and in those days, windjammers would come in from Australia, carrying coal and wheat and everything, and he'd bring, they called him the man with the derby hat and the morning glory horn. You've seen pictures of phonograph records on the big decorated horn, and he was collecting traditional sea shanties on the Oakland estuary in 22 and 23. Then there was an adventure club at Berkeley, and in the faculty glade, he and his friends, was a Professor Arthur Brodeur, who was a medieval scholar. He studied Beowulf, and Gordon's a ballad scholar, medievalist, the ballad scholar, and they would bring a man named Harry McClintock, who was a railway brakeman in San Francisco, and he did Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, Big Rock Candy Mountain. He was a recording artist. They brought him to perform at Berkeley. So now we're beginning to get at least as early as 22, 23, 25 in places as far apart as Berkeley and Harvard and Greenwich Village. The worlds begin to merge. So a commercial recording artist of hillbilly and cowboy songs teams up with a Harvard-trained ballad scholar and a medievalist to do performances in Berkeley. So, in other words, what I'm saying here is the revival's roots all came together before any left-wing radical or socialist interest in folk song. Now, finally we'll come to labor and radical. Socialists had been singing from the beginning. There was a socialist songbook published in England in 1888 that was circulated in the United States. That's more than 100 years ago. But even before that, there were populist songbooks, Knights of Labor songbooks. This is a book that just came out at Berkeley, Illinois, for Democracy, Workers, and God. It's by a historian named Halker, and he goes through the songs of the Gilded Age, very flowery, really an impossible rhetoric, and bringing together religious beliefs and beliefs in Jeffersonian democracy and a high rhetoric, unsingable songs by today's standards. But there was a populist radical song tradition that clearly wasn't folk, neither was it a high art. It really was closer to what we would now call parlor ballads, sentimental songs, to pop music of that period. But somehow in 1905, when the Wobblies started, Industrial Workers of the World, for ideological reasons, they were, you know the term I use, syndicalists rather than socialists?
Yeah.
The syndicate, the mafia. Syndicalism is a French-Italian word. Syndicat simply means an association. So unions in France and Italy were called syndicats. And some of the Italian, French, and Spanish anarchists broke with Marx way back in the time of the First International. Marx envisioned labor people in politics and a unified state, a unified party, what they used to then call the dictatorship of the proletariat. Syndicalists were libertarians. See, we think of libertarians now as kooks like Pat Buchanan, but it's there were left libertarians too who were against capitalism, against big government, big bosses, and so on. Wobblies were left libertarians, a strong emphasis on personal freedom as against the state, against the party. Okay, so Wobblies, for complex reasons, began, they moved away. They inherited this heavy rhetoric, that is because a man who was young in say 20 years old in 1905, would have heard these songs in his adolescence, or come from a family that was populist or Knights of Labor, right? But Wobblies began setting their songs to gospel hymns that were popular, and they began using, for complex reasons, a simple rhetoric. And that's where Joe Hill comes in. And Pete sings A Preacher and the Slave, Casey Jones, Popular Wobbly, and so on. And those songs entered folk tradition. That is, these songs were dead. But the Wobbly songs, by using simple melodies and very plain rhetoric with some humor, getting away from the Victorian rhetoric and the parlor ballads, their songs caught on. Then the Wobblies fell apart after the Russian Revolution. When the communists rebuilt after in the 20s, most communists in the United States sang European revolutionary songs, Italian Bandiera Rossa, international La Marseillaise. They sang a Polish song, Warszawianka, whirlwinds of danger are raging around us. They sang songs like God, it's hard for you to believe this, but young YCLers, and Pete would tell you this if he talked to you, they were singing songs like the Red Soviet Air Fleet, and there's a line in it, fly higher and higher and higher, our emblem is the Soviet star. I mean, honestly, I'm not red baiting or anything, these youngsters at their YCL meetings believed, it was just like believing that Castro was going to free us somehow. They believed that these Soviet airplanes would come over here and liberate us. Well, at any rate, Wobblies, but in 1933, I'm writing about this now, Mike Gold, who was a columnist on the Daily Worker, Mike Gold wrote a column indicating, we're failing in terms of our music. Our music is too revolutionary, it's too foreign. He said, we need a communist Joe Hill. And what he was saying was, we need someone who can sing in the American vernacular. And eventually, the Almanac Singers responded to that. Now, the Almanac Singers, they don't start till people always put it back to the 20s and 30s. They started in 1941.
41. Didn't Gold find Woody Guthrie first? Wasn't he brought around to meetings in the West?
But not through Mike Gold. The guy, Woody Guthrie, wasn't radical, came from Oklahoma to L.A. He wanted to be a hillbilly singer. And there was a guy, there was a communist named Ed, he wrote a little book about it, Ed Robbins. Not Mike Gold. Now, Robin or Robbins wrote for the People's World, which still is going, and Robbins, it's documented, he invited Woody to a free Tom Mooney meeting. This was about 1939. Mooney had just been freed by Governor Olson. This must have been, maybe the meeting was in January of 39. I think the election was in 38. And according to some people, Guthrie fell asleep at the meeting because the comrades were droning on about the revolution. But look how wet it's going to be. God, I hope your car isn't too far. Well, so according to the stories, Guthrie was so prolific that he then wrote a song about Tom Mooney. And Robin liked the song. I think some of this is touched in the biography of Guthrie. So it was the same process. Like, in other words, what happens in the East, you're right, what happens in the East happens in the West. Clearly, communists who want to organize workers and fight for justice, after all, some of them have got to realize that they can't make it with esoteric culture. So they turn to American folk culture. Part of it, there's also a whole turn to the blues. A man named Lawrence Gellert collects songs, and he uses a title about 39 Negro folk songs of protest. The first usage of the term protest song in public print. Now, so what you get through Gellert, you get communists feeling their way into the Afro-American tradition, and ultimately through Guthrie, others, but Guthrie can symbolize it, a reach into Appalachian or Southwestern or what might be called hillbilly tradition. And finally, these converge in New York, where Seeger, Guthrie, and two or three other guys, they formed the Almanac Singers. It's interesting, they did two political albums, one that was very controversial called Songs for John Doe, and there's that period, you'll have to touch it where there was a phrase, the Yanks are not, it's a complicated period because communists follow the Russian line when Russia attacks Finland. No, and then signs the pact with Hitler. They go along and they say that they take an isolationist position. It's hard in retrospect to understand why, and you just have to ask people like Pete and his friends now, if he'll talk to you, how they could rationalize the Hitler-Stalin pact. But they did, if you read the Daily Worker, and in their songs, like they have a song. It's often quoted, "I hate war, and so does Eleanor." It was a song attacking Mrs. Roosevelt, and then the album. Then Hitler turns against Russia. The party line changes, and the commies are clamoring to help defend Russia. So then they do win the war songs and the Reuben James and songs like that. But in that same we're describing a period of like 14 months, or a very tight period where you get musical examples of both positions, and in between they make 2 records for a general label. One was called Deep Sea Shanties, and the other was like Sodbusters
Ballads,
right,
Blues,
those are
something.
important,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because see what they're doing simultaneously. If you have, as I've described, the academic collector stream, the sheet music publishing, the records, the need for people in and out of folk society to cling to the past, and then finally you have a radical labor song tradition from turgid prose to the Wobblies to the communists, and it comes together in the almanacs. They're young radicals, and they want to sing for working people, but they also sing American folk songs in relatively authentic style, or less popular. The almanacs are less homogenized than the Weavers. Now, by the time, then after the war, the almanacs break up, or during the war they break up, and then the party line changes again after the war. I don't know if you've ever followed radical politics, but Browder was in during the war, very popular, and then the Comintern goes into its Cold War period, and a man in France named Duclos writes a letter blasting Browder. They throw Browder out and put Foster in. Well, in that period, the Weavers emerge. But though the Weavers start with the same ideology of the almanacs and the same personnel with some additions, in just a matter of a few years, the Weavers are making money with Gordon Jenkins and Decca, and very popular. Then the Blacklist, which is an interruption, but I think it's important to note their move, collectively, the move on the part of the Weavers to popular, homogenized style occurs before the Blacklist, before the political turn against them. And in a sense, as the Weavers lose power or breaks up, it's sad for the Weavers. A lot of people, they shed crocodile tears because the Weavers couldn't make a living. But the downside of it, or the other side, was it freed a lot of other young people. That really then launched what came to be called the folk song revival. So you could get the Limelighters, who were first, they were at the Hungry Eye, the gateway singers, the Limelighters, the Babysitters in New York, then ultimately the Kingston Trio, then all the clones, the Brothers Four and everything. Now, the interesting thing is that most of those clone groups followed the Weavers musically, working at a pop level, but initially there was a lingering notion that somehow to sing folk songs was progressive, and so even if you took the the Kingston Trio at its most popular height, as mass culture icons. They would do Tom Dooley, an Appalachian ballad. They did an MTA song. And you know their repertoire. So they never left political songs entirely, but that's what I meant earlier. They had the freedom to tie into these various heritages without paying dues. It was ready-made. It was there. And by then the association was so strong for some people that folk music was progressive that an assumption was made if you had a guitar or banjo and if you sang a love song or murder ballad, somehow you were progressive. But these other traditions didn't end. See, you need some kind of a paradigm where, things are moving down chronologically, vertically. Then you get horizontal forces that are moving laterally, integrating some or all of the elements, but not integrating them so completely that it stops the vertical descent or vertical ascent, however you draw the chart of the separate movements, so that hillbilly music becomes country and western, and then bluegrass. Then with bluegrass, it's kind of a return to the roots. Then you get a point where Joan Baez performs with Flatt and Scruggs. So that has to be, here's your Joan Baez learns a song from Charles Seeger, so that, if you have your academic line, then you have your commercial music line and your publishing, then you have the recording line, then you have all the people in and outside of folk society who have psychic needs for antiquity. These are all going this way, and then someone comes along and brings two together or three together, and then you begin to, it could be one thing about a movie is you can do it visually and make it very exciting without drawing charts, but the structure is there. I mean, the thought is still there. And so, all right, you get Johnny Cash learning Pete Lafarge's, Johnny Cash did well with a beautiful version of Ira Hayes, and it just, and then, then you get Mike Seeger coming along and reviving some of the hillbilly music of the 20s, and there were, a lot of the fans debated whether, like, Mike was selling out because he wasn't singing progressive songs. That was part of the revival. And then, of course, we had started with Oakes and Paxton and Dylan and all. Eventually, it's interesting to me, very interesting, that Afro-American urban music that comes out of blues, that is rhythm and blues, through Chicago 45 RPM records reach England and reach working class kids in Liverpool, literally children of stevedores and so on, not intellectuals, not touched by the English. See, Ewan MacColl and Peggy Seeger in England were doing what, say, Pete Seeger did here. But the Beatles were not touched by radicalism at all, although they had genuine proletarian credentials then, and a lot of the communists were singing at the workers or to the workers or for the workers, but not of the workers. But do the Beatles sing working class British songs? No, they turn to black songs from the ghetto, to Chuck Berry and others. And why? Because it helped them get out of those slums. See, just as some people need to, maybe black people in a city singing gospel songs are hanging on to old forms, but white kids in Liverpool singing the same black songs are moving into new forms. So you have the same artistic form can function. It doesn't always function the same. That's an important point. At any rate, by the time rock and roll comes back to America. And I remember the folk song revival. I was teaching at Illinois. It was very big. Our students, every fraternity had a Kingston Trio clone. Every sorority girl wanted, let her hair,
Eye on the hair.
look like Joan Baez, Well, sororities used to have dress codes, and I literally could observe the dress. They couldn't leave the house without wearing hose and, being pretty dressed up. And one morning they started coming out wearing Levi's and barefoot and all looking like Joan Baez. Morning, all of the gals break the dress code, and they're all looking like Joan Baez. Well, I have to pick up my earlier train of thought as to what led to that. On the folk song revival, I guess, hitting the campus, by the time fraternities and sororities picked up on the Kingston Trio, that is, the association with the left or with nostalgia or with in a sense, all of the associations just vitiate. It simply becomes another fraternity, sorority activity. It's completely Americanized, and Joan Baez is on the cover of Time, and look, the Kingston Trio, they made millions of dollars. They did as well by pop culture as anyone could do, and then there were hootenannies on television, and of course but then, I know how to pick up the rock and roll. I remember my thought. I was on the campus when the Beatles did their first American appearance in Chicago, and a number of students who had been in our folk song club, who had Vega banjos and Gibson guitars, and were Kingston Trio clones. I remember they went to Chicago and they came back. I didn't go, but it must have just been electric. It just. In fact, I wish I could find it for you. One of our students, he wrote a great song. I'm trading in my banjo for a Bolex.
Oh, I would love.
I've got to find that for you. Yeah, I've got to find that for you, because if you could get someone to say, they gave up the guitars and banjos. Some of them